All right, so welcome to economics. What exactly is economics? It's a social science, although in many schools it's in the College of Business, but it's a social science that is basically one of the sciences aimed at figuring out how humans make choices and organize themselves. So we'll call it the science of choice. You may have heard things like it is the discipline that studies how limited resources are distributed amongst human material wants. That's basically right. We're just looking at sort of how we make our choices in the world of materialness, in the world of goods, services, our labor. How do we spend our time, and what motivates it? So we'll talk about what exactly the economic problem is and how different societies can answer that organizational question of how to make their economics happen in other lectures. Our learning objectives for this video are basically just to introduce the context of how economics is born. It's one of the youngest of the disciplines. And then to track the changes to Western ideas of motivation and social order. There's been some pretty big changes there. For instance, is greed good? No. Then yes. And then finally introduce Adam Smith, father of economics. All right, so if economics is one of the younger disciplines, and we'll put its birth date at around 1776, it's clearly younger than mathematics, philosophy, etc., even accounting for that matter. So what gives? Well, basically, if you think about economics as a science of choice, there's not a lot of choice in the subsistence ages of humanity. So if your choice is basically hunt or die, or dig for tubers and make clothing or die, it's pretty quickly accessible what your choice is going to be. So there's no need for economists to study, well, what is caveman X going to do or cavewoman Y going to do? It's pretty clear. There's no textbooks, in other words. Well, when did any or all of this change? We don't know exactly, but it began to change. Here's some of the big chunks of how it changed, we think. And I'm borrowing from Robert Heilbronner's excellent Worldly Philosophers book about some of the history of the fathers of economics. There may have been mothers of economics, but they were not written down. So the agricultural revolution circa around 10,000 years ago moved humanity from hunter-gatherer phase to something more like settled and gathering seeds and growing grain crops phase. So you can imagine what the ramifications are. We've got cities now. People are no longer roaming. They're stable. Some good things happen. Obviously, we begin to, because we've discovered the power of seeds, we begin to increase the productivity and the ease with which we find food, freeing up time for other things. Also, this ends up in some of the research making us a little bit shorter because now our grain consumption is higher. It's harder on our teeth. We lose our teeth earlier. It's unclear if there's more leisure or not. But certainly there's more danger in society. And I mean, people are now stable and wealth is gathering, right, as our productivity is increasing. You now have the possibility of invasion by others, and it's actually pretty easy, right, because they know exactly where you are, they know where your grain stores are, they know where your piles of wealth are. So a new danger arises for society, and that is the danger to roaming bandits or to invasion from outside. And that's important for reasons we'll see. So in the West, and admittedly this lecture is focused on the West, Europe specifically, because that is where the U.S. economy is most closely finds its roots. So in the West, well, the feudal system starts up, and this is a direct response to the dangers of urbanization, if you will. Maybe not urbanization, but at least of people sort of gathering in towns and villages. So authority is now sort of the way that economics is done. And here's what we mean. Because you have this danger from invasion outside, the feudal system is set up whereby peasants are protected at a cost, right? So you can protect yourself within the castle walls by virtue of knights and other sort of the police force, but you've got to give up a portion, and sometimes a pretty high portion of your production. And so the authority, the crown and the royals and the knights, etc., have the authority now to sort of dictate what happens. And so you can think of them as one of the first sort of centers of economic decision making. They decide, how production happens. They decide where production happens, and they decide the price. And it's not for nothing that this whole system is really set up around safety and stability. And this is interesting because now we would say our system, some of the highest goods and motivation in our system are from entrepreneurship, are from taking risks. Well, you can see that doesn't make sense at all for a society like this. Another signpost on the way to the birth of economics will be the Protestant Reformation. So Martin Luther in 1517 nails his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. This idea is basically that the power of the Catholic Church, which had been very embedded and sort of married to the political and economic decision-making centers, is now quite literally divorced. So what this means is whatever values the Catholic Church had brought to bear on economic decision-making, so the Crown and the Catholic Church are sort of together deciding things. Well, it's a pretty conservative situation, right? The Crown wants to protect its power, the Church wants to protect its power, and so you have laws that are very conservative. And also, because there's so much in the Bible against greed, there are a lot of laws around things that look like they could lead, they either proceed from or could lead to greed, like entrepreneurship and lending money, etc. So there are laws against usury, there are laws against, for instance, technological improvement. In France in the 1600s, people are put to death if they are found to be guilty of the high crime of adding more threads per square inch to their textiles. Now, remember, this is a society in which order and stability are paramount, and so anything that threatens to destroy that stability or challenge that stability and throw this tenuous society into even more chaos is not good for society, and so it is swiftly punished. And if you ever wonder why there was so little new technology, so little innovation before the Italian Renaissance and before the Industrial Revolution, it's not that there wasn't, it's that it was punished, and so there was no incentive to follow through on it. So church and state are divorced somewhat, and you see a falling away of some of the visible decision makers. So as you can imagine, people get a little bit freaked out. Who is in charge of running the show anymore? You still have the crown, but in England especially, that things get a little more tenuous. It's not clear who's running the show. And remember, this is new, at least for people that have lived for, people in the last few hundred years. It's new. You have the feudal system. You're used to people, to someone being visibly in charge, and that's beginning to erode. Plus, you have something that's interesting with the Protestant, the rise in Protestantism. You have the rise of the Protestant work ethic. So even Protestants, obviously, if they believe in the Bible, have to sort of cast a side eye at greed and selfishness. And so how do we get from the Protestant Reformation to entrepreneurship that we see today? Well, a lot of this has to do with John Calvin and the sort of the Protestant work ethic, which is, if hard work is good for the soul, and hard work sometimes brings material reward, then who are we to frown on material reward? Perhaps Sometimes that is a sign of God's favor. So this shift in thinking is a pretty large but subtle shift that no longer is gain always ill-gotten or to be frowned upon, but that as long as you're not spending it on drink or prostitutes, your gain can be good and can be a sign of favor from God. So again, just to reflect on the idea that innovation has been sort of the enemy of stability for quite a long time. But that's beginning to change. Starting with the Italian Renaissance and the idea that the invention of human minds can be beautiful. Leonardo da Vinci helps the world, helps the West at least a lot out here in sort of reinvigorating, rebirthing basically the idea of innovation as beautiful, innovation in art, and this begins to bring with it resources from society. We begin to sort of spend energy, effort, money towards innovation. And of course, a lot of this is for war, which a sad or maybe not sad fact is that humanity's penchant for war has yielded some of the most important innovations of all, including the internet. So the age of invention begins, and it's not necessarily always for profit. Again, fanciful machines and war machines are a lot of what comes out of this period. But inevitably, we stumble on some machines that are useful for production, and so the game changes. Not unlike the agricultural revolution, you have a complete shift in how things are going to be produced in society. And as production changes, so do society's relationships. So instead of production happening in houses and on fields, so not only is the type of production changing, we're moving from sort of agricultural production to industrial and consumer goods production. And there's a couple things going on here that sort of push this to the perfect storm. You have the rise of machines, right? And so you have the rise of power, right? As we figure out that the water wheel can power these large sewing machines. You have cities like Manchester, cities like London, cities in the northeast U.S., always located on rivers for power, spring up. But where do the workers come from, and why does this sort of happen so suddenly? What has happened in England, at least, is that peasants have been thrown off their land by the enclosure movement. And so you have, over a period of time, you have wealthy aristocrats, the landed aristocrats, the ones with land, who are sort of in charge, right, of Parliament, in charge of the laws. They have found that the price of wool has risen, and so they are finding it more profitable to raise sheep on their property than to let the peasants farm it. And so they put fences, enclose basically all of their lands, and now you have a bunch of hungry peasants wandering the countryside, desperately needing work, desperately needing food. And this is the type of workforce that fits right in and makes it easier for these large factories to spring up. Of course, it doesn't happen overnight, and England even puts up laws against migration between counties. The people in power are very afraid of this hungry mob wandering around. But sooner or later, they find their way to the cities where there are jobs, albeit at very meager wages, but there's jobs. If you want to start thinking about this in economic terms, labor becomes plentiful and land becomes scarce, and capital, or these machines, are in need of workers to run them. So this is a modern picture, obviously, but it's not too different from the picture taken in the last slide of the Industrial Revolution. Drawing. You still have people that are selling their labor as a commodity, which, by the way, is a kind of a new thing. People's identity is not as wrapped up in sort of what their family has done for eons. You're born to a bread maker doesn't mean you're a bread maker. You're born to a shoemaker doesn't mean you're going to be a shoemaker. Born a woman doesn't mean that you're going to be, always tending the hearth, so to speak. So labor becomes more of a commodity, and we are separate from our work, and we sell our work to the highest bidder, and this is an important change as well. And it's clear that society has changed pretty rapidly from the hunter-gatherer and the sort of subsistence farmer roots that we've had to something that is much more dynamic and much more unstable. But standards of living are undoubtedly much, much higher for most of us. One of the things that's the most troubling about this for society is that the people that are in charge are changing. So we've seen the falling away of the physical church's responsibility, falling away of the crown, the falling away of the very visible structures of economic decision-making and power. And not only does the world seem a little more chaotic because nobody's ordering society, but it also seems more chaotic because the poor are rising to the top in some ways. And I don't mean all the poor. There's still plenty of hungry and desperate sort of laborers working at subsistence wages for your rich industrialists. But I'm also talking about the fact that your rich industrialists are not who you'd expect. The people getting rich in the Industrial Revolution are not the power brokers of yesterday. They are not the landed aristocracy. They are not the powerful families. Why not? Because business was looked down on. Business was always the realm of the sort of traveling salespeople, the families that would basically do flea markets in each town, and sort of industry is a lower class endeavor. So the upper classes never dirtied themselves with industry, and so the people poised to get rich are not the power brokers. They are lower classes, basically. So the lower class, and don't forget that in Europe, much more of a class-based society than the U.S. has been. This is very important. This is sort of not just puzzling, but disturbing turn of events. And you begin to see this in fights in Parliament, in the House of Commons, as the industrialists have different ideas and different interests than the landed aristocrats. The industrialists, for instance, want cheap corn, and so because this makes they don't have to pay their workers as much, right? Because they have to pay their workers at least the cost of food, or else their workers are going to start dropping like flies. So industrialists want corn. They want cheap corn. Where do you get cheap corn? France. Industrialists want to buy corn from France. They want free trade from France. Industrialists in England, at least. Meanwhile, the landed aristocrats in England, of course, do not want the competition of trade with France for agricultural goods. And so they sort of fight for decades about this. Free trade is a nice idea unless you happen to own land that profits from agriculture. So things are a little topsy-turvy, at least in England. And now we come to Adam Smith. So all of this turmoil, all of these changes are nothing for Adam Smith. Adam Smith sees through it all. He sees something that nobody else can see. And to be fair, he's not necessarily inventing all of these ideas. He's culminating, he's bringing in, this is the culmination of all the ideas that are out there. He puts them together in what we would call the first textbook of economics, his Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, hence the birth of economics as 1776. And one of his most famous quotes is this: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that I expect my dinner, but from his regard to his own self-interest." So this pithy, short statement belies a lot. It is the final nail in the coffin, if you will, of the idea that greed and self-interest is always bad. Notice that he turns it into saying, look, it's nice that people do nice things for each other, but to expect that as a way to feed myself and my family is pretty stupid and dangerous. And if we allow society to make their own choices in what they produce and what they buy, we'll find that people's needs are met, right? For the most part, because people need to eat. And so therefore it is profitable to make food for others to eat and thereby earn the money to feed your own family. So wherever society's needs are, we should expect that without the church, without the crown, without any formal decision-making body, we can still organize society in a pretty good way, in a pretty efficient way. When you cut out the middleman, the buyers and the sellers, or the demanders and the suppliers, if you will, figure it out, right? And resources that are limited in society get sort of maneuvered into the spots where they do the most good. There's some problems with this idea. There's some definite weaknesses. It doesn't always hold true, but as an idea of how you might organize this, the central principle on which you might organize society, that's what Adam Smith has given us.